1, 2, 3.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin. And for those who have just joined us, Scéalta is a joint production of Coláiste Feirste here in Phobal. Scéalta was revived a year ago during the beginning of the lockdown. And over that period, we've interviewed, I think, in the region of 50 plus individuals from the world of music to the world of politics, people who have been writers, people who have been broadcasters, people who have been campaigners, people who have seen the need to make a mark in whatever the profession or the occupation that they've chosen. I have never interviewed someone who has encumbered all of those things. And my guest this evening is Fergus Ó. He has been a student civil rights activist. He, of course, is an Irish language activist. He is someone who has been involved in writing and producing books. He is someone who's been involved in broadcasting. He's an educationalist. He's a brother. He's an uncle. He's all of those things. And he's also quite modest. So what I'm going to try and do is tease out over the next hour all of that. So Fergus, don't you do the apologising, let me do it. Or don't do the modesty either, let me do that part of it. So for those who have just switched on to the programme, and we're going to cover part of your involvement in the H-Block campaign, H-Block Armagh campaign and stuff like that. It's a hop, skip and jump through that political, cultural, social life that you have been to the centre of. So to begin with, the obvious and the easy question is, where are you from?
Well, Gerry Margaret, Joe Tassia and Jas Levin Shaw. It's a great honour to be on your show. I've enjoyed many of the previous sessions. I'm from Belfast. I was born in Ardoyne. We lived in Ardoyne when it was a mixed estate way back in the 50s. And in a very short period, when we were quite young, we moved to Andersonstown over to West Belfast. And we lived in the Brown estate round by Slemish Way. And then we moved up to the new White estate when it was being built. So that was the early years. I often think back as to where did my interest in politics or even my overall political attitude come from. I remember as we were growing up, you would have things like on the radio news, because we didn't have television in those days. You would be listening to the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, which was seen as a frightening thing. We were listening to the election of John F. Kennedy, which we thought was a wonderful thing. We listened to the Bay of Pigs or the Cuban crisis. And again, we were in terror that the world was going to blow up. And we listened to the civil rights movement in America. Just by the time we began to get in the mid-60s, when television began to become available in some people's houses. My first experience of television was when we were living in Slemish Way, and my uncle, or my aunt, my cousins and my uncle and aunt's family got a television, a little cabinet with a tiny small screen, about 12 inches. And I remember standing, looking in the window at the television. We were obviously eventually we were brought in to actually see the television, but our first experience was looking through the window and seeing this television. So when television came around, I think one of the things when you look back over the years, and it's difficult now to explain to young people growing up the experience and the life that we have lived. Largely, I think, because, or one of the major factors is the growth of media. And that's something I think which has changed dramatically during our lifetime. I mean, people, our parents' generation who grew up in the 20s, 30s or whenever, would have been introduced to radio, and that was a big change at that time and led to social changes. In our generation, we had television, and that led to major social changes. That let us see the war in Vietnam and the killings and the horror that was going on there, because the authorities hadn't quite learnt, as they have learnt very effectively now, how to control the media. So cameras got in, and we saw children running from napalm and from the bombs and all the rest of it. We saw the civil rights movement in America, and people have been beaten off the streets by police forces, by the police force, cruelly beaten, unjustifiably beaten. Then we saw the situation in South Africa and so on. And somehow or other, for some reason which I often wonder about, we automatically chose the side of those who were being oppressed. And I just assumed that was natural and that everyone would choose that side. And it's only when you grow up and you meet people who chose the other side. And then you say, yeah, well, obviously people made a choice when we were all seeing the same thing, but somehow whatever was in our background, what our parents taught us, whatever we learnt in school or wherever we learnt in the society that we lived, a lot of us of the generation that I was involved with chose, and from the society that I came from, chose the side of the oppressed. And I think that has been, insofar as one can look back and see what's been a guiding light through your life, I think that's the light that we followed, and have tried to change that. I have seen, even all through the struggle here, through the civil rights movement, and then through the prison struggles and the whole struggle that went on here, I have always viewed that as part of a world struggle, that we were trying to advance the world. In fact, one of the things which we felt when we were growing up in the 60s was that we were on an historical and inevitable journey of progress, and that the world was getting better.
Let me stop you. I want to ask you a question just on that subject. and you mentioned the magnitude of what was happening in the latter half of the 60s and the early 70s and all of that. And people don't, not only young people, but older people don't really get the importance of those who took to the streets around civil rights. And they don't really, I think, have a sense of the courage that it required. I mean, this was a state that we all live in, that was monolithic, that had the Special Powers Act, that had draconian legislation, that had a police force that was readily and handy with their batons. So to be involved in those demonstrations, for instance, in the 60s for civil rights, around the blockading of the City Hall, the marches to Burntala, the agitation in the street, the refusal to be intimidated, were you aware that this was changing our world, if not the world, but certainly our world?
Well, there's a number of questions that you raised there. One of the things was we were quite innocent. Now, some of us were probably wiser than others. I was in the more innocent bracket, I would imagine. So we were in the 60s. The world had suddenly changed from the dour and dark period, post-war period in the 50s. Suddenly we had television, as I said, black and white television. We had the Beatles. We had John F. Kennedy in the White House, a young, handsome, Irish president. The world seemed to be, as I said, we seemed to be on an unstoppable journey of progress. So then we began with the civil rights movement, and we began to learn about the injustices and so on that existed here. You were sort of aware of them at the back of your mind, and I think my parents were were certainly aware of it, because when I think back on brief conversations which I heard from them, they would have been aware of the situation, obviously, in which they lived, but I think they tried to shield us from that. So we grew up relatively innocent of the facts of life as regards living in this little statelet. So we went out onto the streets and sort of assumed that, oh yeah, well, there's problems here, but in this new democratic age, and you had the Labour Party in power in Britain, Harold Wilson, this presented himself as this cuddly little prime minister, smoking his pipe. You know, all we would have to do was to have a few demonstrations, point out that the voting system was unfair and that a lot of people were disenfranchised, mostly the Catholic community, because they didn't own property, and there was a property connection to the vote. You had to have property in order to vote in local elections. There was a lack of jobs and so on. That all we had to do was to bring these matters to the attention of the authorities as we saw them, and they would say, "Oh God, we didn't realise that. We'd sort that out for you." So there was this, like, that's possibly an over-exaggeration, but there was that sense of naivete, as they say, that you go out and that things would be sorted out, and then we would get back onto our young lives of enjoying the music and whatever else was happening in those early days. So you didn't go out necessarily at the start with a sense of fear. You went out with a sense of anticipation, of innocence, and as you would probably know yourself, Joe, in all of these things, you're with people, you're with your comrades, your friends. There's a sense of joy and happiness and crack going on in the whole thing. And so it came as quite a learning experience and a shock when suddenly you get hit over the head by a police baton. I often used to say when I was teaching that one of the best educational aids I had ever come across was an RUC baton, because it makes you stop and think. Why is someone so opposed to these very reasonable demands that we're asking? Houses and jobs and votes. What could be more basic? Why is someone so opposed to these things that they're prepared to send the police out and beat us off the streets? And eventually, in a very short period of time, to shoot us off the streets. And one of the things which amazes me when I look back was how much happened in such a very short period of time. The civil rights movement started in 68. The famous Derry March on October the 5th, was on October the 5th. The People's Democracy, of which I was a member, started a day or two after that. Within 10 months, British troops were on the streets and people were being shot dead. 10 months from the start, from we started until suddenly the whole of society had blown up around us. And basically what had happened, unknowing to ourselves, possibly there were those with more experience than we were. We were students coming out for the first time. I was in Dublin, a student in Dublin at the time, so I would come up here for marches and demonstrations and so on. But that unknown to a lot of us, we had touched on the cornerstone of what was holding this state together. We had touched on the gerrymandering and the discrimination, which was how unionism held power as a one-party state for 50 years. And this is not very often referenced now. I think one of the problems with the anti-unionist, that term hasn't been used for a long time, but the anti-unionist opposition, is that we have allowed the debate to begin from 68, 69 or 70. Unionism only talks about what happened from the 1960s onwards. They don't talk about what happened the 50 years before that. In fact, they deny that there was discrimination. Some of them do. And most of the leadership, when I talk about unionism, I'm talking about the leadership, the leaders of unionism.
Yeah, of course.
They deny that there was discrimination, that there was injustice in this statelet. All they talk about is the problems or the violence and so on, which happened when they attacked the people attempts to resolve the problems.
Can I ask you, just in terms from a human perspective, all this, as you say, this massive change, this thing has taken place around student movement, around the formation of the People's Democracy, the Civil Rights Campaign, the housing demands, one man, which should be one person, of course, but one man, one vote, and so on. And you're studying to be a teacher at the same time. This is almost like a parallel. Well, you're allegedly studying to be a teacher. I spoke to someone a while ago who is a head teacher actually in an integrated school, and she made the point that teaching, good teachers are born, they're not trained. Okay. And anyone I've ever spoken about you, who you taught, always said that for some teachers, there were two sides to education. There was the teachers and then there was the pupils. And you were always on the pupil side rather than on the teacher's side. I suspect that's quite accurate. But were you born to be a teacher? Was that what you were always going to be? And how did you manage this political intensity with the need to study to be a teacher?
Well, I didn't study to be a teacher. I was in Dublin. We were studying science, and it wasn't necessarily towards teaching. I had always thought at the back of my mind, there's probably a lot of young people, when they're impressed by the teachers, and when they look around at one of the job roles that you could possibly fulfill because you're in contact with teachers, maybe a lot of people think in that direction. So it was at the back of my mind, but I wasn't being trained to be a teacher. And in those days, the way teaching worked was that you could get your degree or whatever it was, then you could start teaching, and then you would be inspected over a period of 2 years, and then you would get your teaching certificate. Another interesting little aside, which is largely forgotten, in order to be a teacher, you had to sign allegiance to the Queen. Now, this is never mentioned or talked about, and of course, you had to go to a Justice of the Peace, find the Justice of the Peace, and sign this little declaration of the Queen. So of course, I got someone else to go down and sign on my behalf. And that was sort of casual.
Was this every teacher in every school?
Yeah. Yes, up until probably in the early 70s. I think it stopped. I only started teaching in the early 70s, so I think it stopped shortly after that. But we had to sign this declaration of loyalty, and the way we treated it as a bit of a joke, and I can remember getting someone else to go and sign mine on my behalf. So somewhere the Queen in her desk has my signature declaring my loyalty to her, but it's a false signature. Your Majesty, if you're watching, you may throw that one out. Anyway. So I wasn't trained necessarily to be a teacher, and I had a couple of other jobs prior to actually teaching in Dublin. I was working with chemicals and so on, which was interesting because I travelled around the whole of the island. I think going to Dublin and getting a job in Dublin, which involved going to factories all around the country, north and south, was also a very good experience in terms of I think despite ourselves, we tend to have a partitionist attitude. If you're born in the north, you have a different attitude to people born in the south, despite what we may want or think. But getting that opportunity to go around the country at a young age and just see what was happening and so on was interesting and was an eye-opener. I can remember going to Dublin, and I was in the late 60s, starting university, and not long after the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. And so when I got to Dublin, I took it upon myself to go and visit all the sites of the Rising where the Rising had taken place. And I was in digs in this very nice little house down by the rugby station. The rugby stadium was just behind the house. And I had bought a book of Pearse's writings, and I was reading this book and visiting all these sites. And I remember the landlady, who was a sort of middle-aged, little typical Dublin woman. She was talking to her neighbour, and she was saying to her, "Isn't it really good that he's up there and he's reading Pearse? Isn't it great to see a young person interested in Pearse?" So that was part of my going to Dublin. The other thing which struck me about Dublin was whenever the Troubles started, the attitude was, why can't you all live together? The number of times it was said to me, why can't you all live together, was just amazing. And you had to go through the whole situation and explain it to them. And then what used to happen when I would come up to demonstrations and so on, and occasionally some of my fellow students from Dublin or Cork or Galway or wherever they were, they'd come to Belfast. It was a whole new experience. They'd come to Belfast for the demonstrations or just for the weekend. And I remember one particular occasion where during the early civil rights movement, there were a lot of PD members getting arrested. And there was a period when it was brought in, if you went in a demonstration, there was an automatic 6-month sentence.
Yeah.
So we would come up from Dublin and come into my brother's house where I was living at the time. And the conversation would be who was in jail, who'd got out of jail, who'd been arrested, and so on. This was just a normal conversation. And I remember one of my university colleagues saying she couldn't believe this conversation. She said whenever she went home, they talked about who was dead, who was sick, and who got married.
Yeah.
Here in Belfast, we talked about who was in jail, who had got out, and who had just been arrested, and who was expecting to go in, and so on. So that was how we managed it. We sort of proselytized down there. What I did was to try to explain as best I could the situation in the north, and then to bring people to the north to actually let them experience it, which was a very quick learning experience for most of them. And we come up to demonstrations and so on. A lot of them couldn't believe basically the scenario. But again, it was all part of the crack. They come up to Belfast and experienced all of this. Just another one I can remember was we went to Lena's. I don't know whether people remember. There's still a Lena's on the Falls Road down at Twin Spires, but it used to be up round by the baths, I think, opposite.
That's right.
The baths, and it was open all night, so you would go down there to get cigarettes or something in the middle of the night. And I remember one of my friends from Dublin, where we drove down to Lena's in an old Ford something or other, Ford Popular or something, and we were parked. The car was parked outside Lena's. Someone went in to get the cigarettes, and a shot rang out. So this guy from Dublin, as he was amazed to hear the shot, and that was his story to go back to Dublin with. That he'd been in Belfast in the middle of the night and he heard gunfire. By the time we went back up to the house, and then the next morning we got up and looked at the car, and there was a bullet hole in the car.
If he only knew, it could have been a better story.
Yeah, indeed. So those were the university experience. Obviously, you had a lot of studying and stuff to do as well, but you balanced it.
You are renowned for your modesty, I have to say, but just let me correct you. You may have came to teaching in the 70s. You went on to teach very successfully and become headmaster in, I think, St. Thomas's?
No, in the Meánscoil.
In the Meánscoil side, but you taught in St. Thomas's prior to that, didn't you?
I taught in St. Thomas's, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, St. Thomas's was a wonderful school. It had a reputation in other parts of the city as being a sort of rough school, and the kids, the students, used to some degree to play up to that image. I remember we would go to a football match. We'd bring our team over to a football match, and all the nicest kids you could ever meet, all lively young lads in their teens, pleasant, mannerly, just nice kids. And then they would come and meet this other team, and they would change into the image that was expected of them. They'd become wee hard men, all of a sudden. And so the image, they sort of felt they had to live up to that image. But it was a great school, and there was a great camaraderie, I think, between most of the teachers and the students. I can remember, I mean, we went through some really horrendous times, and the students, I think, one of the policies of the school was that the school should be a sort of a chairman in Irish, a sort of place where the kids could be safe from what was going on around them. The school was situated just in Ballymurphy on the White Rock Road, in the Ballymurphy area, and there'd be gun battles and soldiers around all the time. I can remember on one occasion, this is one of those crazy stories, where there was a sort of truce at lunchtime because the kids would be out on the in schools playing. So the British soldiers wouldn't drive up and down the road, or would try not to, because it'd be hassle and so on. But on this particular day, a couple of jeeps come down the road, and someone threw a stone at them. And I was on what we call yard duty on this particular day, so I was out watching all of this. And the jeep stopped and pulled these two lads into their jeep, who had nothing to do with it, because I could see them. They were just dandering down the road. Someone on up the road threw a stone. The jeep stopped and they pulled these two kids in. So I ran and jumped onto the back of the jeep. As they went up, this is one of these crazy, silly stories, of which there are a million. You could tell, I'm sure, a lot of them yourself, Joe. But so I jumped onto the back of this jeep, but I was hanging on to the thing which they had to stop the
Yeah.
wire from cutting the soldier's head. I was hanging on to this, and this soldier was trying to beat me off with the edge of his rifle. And I looked back, and the head teacher, Sean McKeown, who was a wonderful man, father of Kieran McKeown, as it happens, subsequently became involved in the peace movement. He was running up the road, and the whole school was running up the road behind him. He had this incredible image of the two jeeps running up the road, the two kids in the jeep, quite frightened, me hanging onto the back of this jeep, and the whole of the school running up behind him. So anyway, and Sean McComb said, Mr. O'Hare, come back, come back. But we ended up in Springfield Barracks, myself and the two kids, and it was an hilarious situation because they tried to put us all against the wall. And I said, I haven't been arrested. I'm not standing against the wall. So there's this thing. You have these young Brits, they're 18-year-old, 19-year-old. They're not long out of school, some of them. So they have this sort of sense of not knowing how to handle a teacher who's being very teacherly. Who's sort of adopting this attitude of, I am a teacher, or whatever it was. So I refused to stand up the wall, and they didn't know what to do, so they just let me not stand up against the wall. So then they started asking the kids questions, and I would say to the kid, you don't have to answer that. And then they would ask another one. I said, well, you can answer that if you like, and you don't have to answer this. So eventually they threw the three of us out. But as we were going out through the door of Springfield Road Barracks, this young soldier pulled me back, and he said, I don't want to use bad language on your show.
No, please don't.
But he says, I don't know what kind of a blank, blank, blank school that is, but the blank, blank teachers are worse than the pupils. As he threw us out onto the street. So that was just one. But it was a wonderful school, and a lot of, I still made a lot of the students there, and a lot of them went on to do great things and are involved in a lot of them in the community and so on. So I worked there.
I want to come on to the Meánscoil, but let me ask you this question, and then we'll move on. As I say, we'll hop, skip, and jump through most of your life, but certainly not all of it. And I'm looking over your shoulder, and I see just right in my eye line the guitar, and I want to talk about your love of music and your love of political music in particular. But did you, in a general sense, did you enjoy teaching? Did you find it a worthwhile experience?
Yes. I enjoyed the teaching. When I went on to become principal and so on, that was fine as well, because you were doing a very important job. But I found the most enjoyable bit was in the classroom with the students and seeing them actually learning. I mean, one of the things, I remember we were doing a very complex piece of chemistry, and I was going through it line by line and watching the pupils. And you could tell at one point they got lost. They could follow this part of it and that part of it, the next part, and then you looked and they were suddenly lost. And it turned out it was nothing to do with the chemistry, that this was in a period where they were bringing in new mathematics, and they had decided not to teach cross multiplication, if I say that right. And this was part of the chemistry. So they were getting lost with the maths. And I went and spoke to the maths teacher about this, and he accused me of being a very reactionary teacher, wanting to teach these old ideas. But that's another story. Yes, so I enjoyed the actual process of teaching.
1980 comes along to add to the turmoil that we already had. We had the 1980 hunger strike. The anniversaries are coming up very soon. 1980 and the 1981. You found yourself on the H-Block committees, and to a large extent been part of that ability, or part of that need to organise around support for the prisoners. And it was a very intense period. It was a very demanding, physically very demanding, and mentally very demanding. How did you? Was it just a natural progression of your need to campaign? How did you end up on the H-Block committees?
Well, that's an interesting story. I mean, I know you have to move on, but just to fill in slightly, from the civil rights period, we then moved in very quickly from 68, 69. By 71, it was internment. Hundreds and thousands, eventually, of young people were just taken off the streets and thrown into jail without trial. And I became involved in the campaign around internment. I was involved in a number of various committees, and eventually we set up the Political Hostages Release Committee, which organised a mass campaign, and I was the chairperson of that. Then when internment eventually faded out in the mid-70s, and then we had the period of the trials around the informers and so on, that whole period.
Yeah.
And by 1976, the issue around the H-blocks had started, whereby the situation was that anyone who was tried after March, 1st of March, or maybe the 31st, so 1st of March in 1976, would lose political status, which we had won through previous campaigns. So what actually happened was that the PD, now this may sound a bit, party political, but the PD began a campaign of making people aware of this. So we started a petition. I remember standing in Castle Street asking people to sign a petition to defend political status, and people would say to you, but sure, they have political status. And then you would explain what was happening. So the petition was basically an idea, an attempt, or an opportunity to allow us to start getting the message out. We went around the estates, door to door, getting petitions. Again, we weren't expecting the petition to change anything, but it gave us an opportunity to start getting the message out. So that went on for a period, and then the Relatives Action Committees were set up. Now, not to be cause political turmoil, but the relationship between PD and Sinn Féin changed from time to time, and we were going through a bad period at that point. So there was an attempt. The people did not want, Sinn Féin did not want the PD and the left on this committee. And this is just to give the context. And again, I'm not trying to make party political points, but it's just what happened. The PHRC went through that period, and remember Maura Drum was a great supporter of that. And the night we had organised a meeting in Queen's University to try to get the students mobilised and to get them organised and build a political hostage release committee there. And Maura came to speak, which was quite a big thing for her to come out, into that sort of open space where she might have been vulnerable in over at Queen. So she came over to speak, and that was fine. We had a great meeting, and I went back. And then the next morning, there was a statement in the paper from the Belfast Court Counter of Sinn Féin, attacking PD as a micro-left organisation who was trying to claim, kudos on the backs of political prisoners and that sort of stuff. It was one of those things that happened from time to time.
Yeah.
So that was the scenario in which we had then come, and that period lasted for a while, and was still there when the RACs were set up. So there was a meeting in Ballymurphy, in the Ballymurphy Community Centre, which is no longer there, and to set up a local RAC, and one of the women, the mother of the prisoners, put my name forward, and it was said from the platform that we wouldn't be allowed. I'm not a relative, therefore I wouldn't be allowed. And basically the relatives said they are the only ones who've been actually highlighting this. That was because of the petition. And we want him on this committee. So that was how I was put onto the RAC committee. And then relationships changed again, and things got better, and that was it. But it's just, as you know, with political parties, they go through up and down and hot and cold with each other, and this was a bit of a cold period. But then, so I was on the Relatives Action Committee, and basically just helping with that work and trying to give whatever input I could into it. And then the big debate, there were big debates that went on in that period, and I think PD was arguing that the campaign needed to be opened out, because if people remember, the RACs were calling for POW status and that you needed to support the armed struggle. And we were arguing that, no, we should open it out to anyone, irrespective of your attitude. So this debate went on and on for a while.
Blunt approach to it.
Yes, a broad approach. So the outcome of that, to make a long story short, was that people eventually came around to that view. And I'm not saying that we were the only ones who held the view. There were people in Sinn Féin who held the same view. But the debate went on for a while, and then eventually it was resolved through the creation of the National H-Block Armagh Committee, which, rather than demanding support for particular political aspects or whatever, produced 5 demands and said basically 5 humanitarian demands for the prisoners: that they would have no prison uniform, no prison work, free association, political status, and the return of remission of that they had lost because of being on the protest. So then the National H-Block Armagh Committee was set up, or the National H-Block Committee as it was originally. And then it became the National H-Block Armagh Committee. So that was set up. I was elected onto that and became involved in the whole campaign, or continued in the campaign around that.
Can I ask you, out of that, and we all know the horrors of the prison conditions, and we know that the turmoil of the hunger strike and all of that. You found yourself in shortly after that, you found yourself in Belfast City Hall as a councillor, before there were any Sinn Féin councillors. I think 2 members of the PD, yourself and John McNulty, was it?
Yeah, that's right.
Hard as an old lefty at that stage. Now it's common practice. Now we all know councillors and we're familiar with them. But at that stage, how difficult was it for you in Belfast City Council? The bastion, as Martin O'Miller has described it, of bigotry. How difficult was it?
Well, it was quite difficult. We were on a steep learning curve, and you had a situation, for example, that myself or McAnulty would stand up to speak, and Sammy Wilson, who was also a councillor at the time, he would stand up and propose a motion that the member be not heard. That we would, in other words, that they would not listen, that we wouldn't be allowed to speak. So they would vote on this, and it would be passed, and then we would continue to speak anyway. So the RUC would be called in, and we would be taken out of the chamber by the RUC, and this happened fairly regularly. So that you had that sort of difficulty. There was an ironic story which happened as well during that period, because one of the other councillors there was someone whom a lot of our listeners, or your listeners, might not remember, a man called George Seawright, who was so sectarian in his attitude that he was put out of the DUP. He called for Catholic priests to be incinerated and all this sort of stuff.
Just imagine, to be too sectarian to be a member of the DUP. How bad must you have been?
Well, but strangely enough, he was a Scottish guy, and he didn't have he was politically sectarian, but he didn't appear to be personally sectarian. So he would talk to you. Some of the other unionists wouldn't even speak to you. Some of them, I remember Frank Miller was there, and if he would meet you coming down the corridor, you could see him physically trying to dissolve into the wall rather than patch you. That's a slight over-exaggeration, but it was the sort of sense of what was there. But I remember when we'd be taken out by the RUC, George Seawright would stand up and say, in a Scottish accent, and I won't mimic it, he said, "I disagree with these men, absolutely and totally, but they have the right to speak." And he would walk out in protest at us being excluded.
Right, yeah.
And you had a situation then whereby there'd be ourselves and George Seawright in the tiny little members' room. The members' room is probably not bigger than the sitting room here. You probably remember that, Joe.
I do, yeah.
And what would happen there'd start to be a conversation between myself and George Seawright. And as I say, he wasn't personally sectarian. He would talk quite openly to you. So he started to talk about his political point of view, and I started to talk about mine, because he used to have this attitude whereby he would be opposed to the fur-coated unionism, and he would argue in defence of the Simon community. I remember a debate where the Simon community were trying to open a centre on the Antrim Road, and it was been objected to by the local councillors, and he opposed this. the local councillors who were and accused him of being part of the Unionist Fur Coat Brigade. So I was asking him when we were talking, I said, how can you be such a defender of the homeless and the Simon community and the work that they're doing, and at the same time want to incinerate Catholics? We went through our political point of view. I said I was a socialist, and therefore I thought that everyone should have the right to, or each country should have the right to control itself, and therefore I was opposed to British domination and so on in Ireland. And he said, and it was quite an interesting admission on his part. He said, I can see the logic in your position, and I can see the illogicality, or I can see that there is an illogicality in my position, but I am a loyalist. And that's what he said. So
Rather, I rest my case.
How do you get around that? So it was difficult. It was difficult.
Can I jump you forward again? This is very unfair, and it's a consequences, Fergus, I have to say, of you having a full life. If you only had half of the accreditations that you have, I would have a more relaxed program. But
my life, Joe, you wouldn't call it a full life. Anyway.
Your Irish language campaigning, and you mentioned that you were the principal of Gaelscoil na Wall, but prior to that you were
Meánscoil Feirste.
Meánscoil Feirste. But you campaigned prior to that. So tell me how that came about.
Well, during the whole well, just before I say this, people sometimes say to me, oh, why did you leave politics, or it's a pity you left politics, or blah, 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 and went into the Irish language movement. And my attitude is that I never left politics, that language and culture are centrally political, particularly this sort of culture, because it's part of what forms your mind and your attitude. And I firmly believe that the biggest weapon that we have, and I think Gramsci or somebody said this, the biggest weapon, the most powerful weapon that we have is the mind, a person's mind. If you can convince people of an idea, then that's the strongest thing you have on your side. And that culture and language are all part of forming those ideas. So I think that the whole issue of culture and language is central to political developments, particularly in a sort of situation like this, where it's an anti-imperialist situation. When you and the important point is, or to emphasize that point, the imperialists, the countries who dominated the world, know that so well, because one of the first things they did was, when they took over a country, was to destroy the native language and the native cultures, which is why we have now what is called the English-speaking world, the French-speaking world, the Spanish-speaking world, where these major imperial powers went into different countries and changed the language and forced people to speak the imperial language, and it happened here because of that idea of changing people's attitudes and ideas. So I think it's very important, and it is very political.
And of course, Pierce said that when he talked about the murder machine. But
that's right, exactly.
But take me to the question. So I understand the logic of it, but when did you take up this mantle?
Well, whenever I was in the PD in the early days, before we had telexes and Raidió Fáilte or email and all of these different things, where you probably remember that, maybe you're too young to remember this, Joe, but you would have a meeting, you would write out a quick statement with a pen, and you would run down to the Irish News and hand it in, and it would be in the Irish News the following morning. It was a great system. Now that we've got all this sophistication, it doesn't work half as well. So as part of that, I used to be writing out statements, and we'd run up to the Andersonstown News. Now, the editor of the Andersonstown News at that point was Sean McAndressa, who unfortunately died recently. And he was part of the Shaw's Road Gaeltacht. And I remember getting in one night there with a statement, and he took it, and his wife, Anya, who's also unfortunately dead, she said to me, "You're a science teacher, aren't you?" This was actually, I can remember, it was in April of 1978. "You're a science teacher." "Yes." "Well, we're going to open a secondary school here in September. Would you be prepared to teach science for an hour a week?" And I said, "Certainly." And then I said, "Well, I have to do it in Irish." And she said, "Oh, of course." And I said, "I'm not sure that my Irish would be up to teaching science at this point." She says, "Don't worry. Sure, we're not we're not opening until September. This was April. We're not opening until September. Sure, we'll run a course and we'll get you up to scratch. No bother. So she was so confident about that. So I said, fair enough, let's go with it. So I spoke to the principal in St. Thomas's and asked, could we make sure that I was free a certain period each week to go up there, and that was sorted. So I did that for 2 years. And then the school closed down, not because of any weakness in the school, but basically at that point, the Shaws Road community, which was about 12 houses, had started the first Bunskull in the north, the first primary school, which they were not getting any funding for. They had started a Meánscoil, a nursery school, for which they were getting no funding, and now they were running a secondary school. And basically they said after the second year, listen, and they were getting no funding for that either. They said, we can't really keep the three things going, so we're going to have to let one thing go, and the logical thing is to let the secondary school go. So the secondary school closed after 2 years. And then so it's closed in 1980. 10 years later, in 1990, there was another attempt. By this stage, the Bunskull got funding, the Meánscoil was funded, and a lot more people were coming into the Bunskull. It wasn't only the Shaws Road community. The local community, the local English-speaking community were sending kids to the nursery and into the Bunskull. So it was a bigger pool of people to help run the whole thing. So the parents came together again and said, well, let's try for another Meánscoil. So we set up a committee. The school was opened in the Culterland in 1991. Myself and Cathal O'Donnell. I then left the job that I was in and went down to this to set up the school, and that's when that started. So we started the Meánscoil in 1991, and it grew exponentially. Again, it wasn't funded. We had a big campaign around that, and eventually we got funding for that, and now it's one of the best schools in Belfast.
I was going to, it's just someone alerting me that there's something happening. I was going to just to mention that when you talk about setting up schools or setting up Meánscoils or whatever it may be, I mean, these were literally set up with no finance, sometimes in one room, teachers working for no salary, and just making do and recycling books and all of that. And that in itself, I mean, when you look, there's hardly an extended family in Belfast from nationalist background, although the language is not the prerogative of the ownership of the nationalists, but there's hardly a family that doesn't have somebody who goes to an Irish-speaking school. And it's taken now as just a matter of course, this is what happens. But there was some campaigning required, massive campaigning required, and much to the credit of people like yourselves. Were you aware, once again, the same question, were you aware this was breaking new ground and breaking all the rules?
Yeah, well, I think the most credit, I mean, there's a lot of people deserve credit, but the most credit must go to the Shaws Road community. They set up that Gaelscoil, and as an almost natural growth, once they started to have kids and so on, the question was, do we send them? We have to send them to school. What school do we send them to? There are no Irish language school. Do we send them an English language school? No, we'll set up our own school. And they set up their own school, and for 13 years they went without funding. They were running around campaigning to get money and little collection boxes and so on. So I think and out of that has grown the massive development which has happened to the Irish language in Belfast and again throughout the north. So there were a number of other Irish schools. There was one other Irish language school had been set up in the city by 1991, I think. There was only the one. Possibly there might have been two of them. But anyway, Gaelscoil Noel had been set up. So I was aware that when the secondary school was set up, that it would be what I described at the time, a quantum leap, because you would have young adults coming out from a secondary school who had had their entire education through the Irish language. And that has subsequently proven to be the case, because when I look around now at the at the growth of the Irish language in Belfast, and also at the leaders of many of those organisations and their ex-Meánscoil, or Coláiste Feirste, as it's now called, their ex-Meánscoil pupils. And I can remember being conscious of trying to ensure that the the pupils got the best education that they could, that there was no way that they would be getting a second-class education, despite all the problems and despite what was happening, despite the lack of funding and so on. And we were assisted. Basically, the way the Meánscoil worked was there were two of us who were employed, and we just worked away. The committee and people just worked away to get money. We got money from Rathcarn in County Meath through various ways and so on. But then we had volunteer teachers who come in. We had Barbara de Bruyne coming in to teach French. We had Noreen Nicleary coming in to teach art. Kieran Dorn coming in to teach English and so on. A whole series. Davy Maguire coming in to teach music. A whole series of members of the community came in to fill up the curriculum. And I can remember then, occasionally, because a lot of these people were working, you would get a phone call saying, Fergus, I'm sorry, I can't come in today if such and such has happened. So my approach to that was, rather than have the kids see something negative and think that they're not a real school because the teacher is not turning up, I would go in and say to them something like, right, instead of having art today, we have a great plan for you. We're going to go up to Colin Glen. And so the kids, rather than thinking that they hadn't got something, thought they'd got something extra, and it was sort of, it developed that very positive attitude.
Let me interrupt you once again, because this is very bad manner to me, but there's only way I can get through the short period. We've been speaking for nearly an hour, and I need to grasp and hop along. You mentioned, or I mentioned earlier, the guitar behind you. I want to talk just briefly about your writing, but I want to talk about your love, your renowned love of music. And you've recently done a virtual concert in the Connolly RSC Connolly Centre. So did you always equate music with campaigning, with political messages, statements, or does your love of music extend well beyond the kind of the political nature of folk music?
Well, we were very lucky in our house. When we were growing up, we were exposed to the music of the McPeak family, whom I think are a wonderful treasure, very underrated in Belfast, very underrated everywhere. And people like Davy Hammond. My uncle, Jimmy Devlin, JG the actor, he had a lot of that music and would have known a lot of the people concerned. So we get music from there, from his house, from the Devlin's house, and we had our own music as well. So that was very formative, being used to that music and hear the pipes and the guitars and the traditional singing and so on. And then when I went to university, it was the period of what was called at that time the folk boom. So at university we would have, I think the first couple of weeks we had a concert where you had Donal Lunny and Paul Brady and people all just playing just in a lecture theatre or something like that. And the folk clubs, we would go to a folk club every week and hear all of the most people who are now famous, world famous, just sitting playing and jamming and playing together and mixing it all up. The folk clubs, the way they ran in Dublin, I don't want to go on too long about this, but the folk clubs ran after the pubs closed, because all of the groups would be out doing their gigging and the pubs getting money, and then they would go afterwards. They would go to the folk clubs, and half of one group would go one club and half would go to another. So I remember sitting one night in the 95 club on Harcourt Street in Dublin, and you had Paul Brady, Donal Lunny, Sean Keane of the Chieftains, Brian Byrne and a couple of other, the top musicians who subsequently became all just up on stage jamming and playing and bouncing off one another and trying out things and so on. And the club would go on to 3 o'clock in the morning, no alcohol at all. You would stop in the middle and have a cup of coffee or a bowl of stew. In fact, there's another wee story I'll try and squeeze in here. The first year at university, we got a job. We were selling screens around, television screens. A bit of a con, but anyway, to enlarge your television, you clip these things on. They worked to a degree, but we were selling them all up and down the little streets between the falls and Shankill and up to Shankill. And we were working with two girls from Limerick, myself and a friend, my mate, and this young fella from the Shankill, Sammy. And every Monday morning we'd come back to work and we'd be saying, well, where were you? Oh, we were down in Limerick, and we would have, myself and my mate, would have hitchhiked to Dublin. This is what we did every weekend. Hitchhike to Dublin on a Saturday, go to the 95 Club from 11 to 3 o'clock in the morning, come out at 3 o'clock in the morning, sleep on a bench, or we used to quite often sleep in the Phoenix Park, and then get up and hitchhike back up again on the Sunday. So we would explain, oh, well, where were we? Oh, we went to Dublin. And Sammy, we'd say to Sammy, Sammy, where were you? And Sammy would say, I didn't go anywhere. So eventually Sammy asked us, listen, can I come to Dublin with you? Certainly. So the three of us headed off to Dublin, into the folk club. And then we had to sleep in the Phoenix Park. And I remember saying to Sammy, Sammy, you're sleeping in Devil Era's back garden, Devil Era being the president. If he knew there was an orange man in his back garden, oh, that's slagging and banter. But there's I'll continue that story, and then we went to mass. At that stage, I was still a mass going young person, and Sammy, of course, we were saying, Sammy, come on round, you can sit at the back, nobody's going to bother you. And Sammy wouldn't come into the church, so we said, okay, we'll meet you here. So we arranged to meet him at the O'Connell statue in O'Connell Street. But before we left him, we gave him a lecture on how O'Connell had won Catholic emancipation, and he better be careful, and so on. But years went past, just to give you the sequel to that story, and the trouble started, and I was involved in the political activity and had a sort of profile around the area or whatever. And I remember coming into the house and rushing, getting ready to rush out, and we needed somebody. So I went down into Dunmurray. We were living up in Dunmurray Lane at the time. Down into Murray to get some chips. I went into the chip shop. There was a queue there, and who is serving the chips but Sammy?
Right? My God.
And so I'm in there, and it's quite a loyalist crowd. I'm in a loyalist crowd, and I looked at Sammy, and he recognised me, and I recognised him, and I'm saying, right, Sammy, I'm in your hands. He could very easily have said something, and I would have been in very serious trouble. So we went up. I got my fish and chips. I didn't say hello, Sammy. He didn't say hello, Fergus. And I left. And I must say I was extremely grateful to him that he didn't say a word. He didn't say, hiya, Fergus. He just gave me the chips and sort of nodded, and away I went. So that was Sammy.
Can we touch? Did he give you extra chips, by the way?
Oh, I'm sure he did. I didn't count them.
Touch briefly, very briefly, on, I mentioned in the introduction, your writing, and you produce, for instance, I know you write, and you're a fairly intense writer of your opinions and views, but your book on fauna and flora that you produced, tell me a bit about that.
Well, just to finish up slightly on the question you put about the music, I never regarded myself as a singer. I regarded myself as a propagandist in 3 chords.
Well, Fergus, let me tell you, I share an interest of folk music with you, and I've heard you singing on many occasions, and you're quite an accomplished singer. I'm not saying that you could have bought a house on the Malone Road with the money you earned singing, but you certainly are. You could pass yourself at a party. And
okay.
Time is not really on our side. So tell me a wee bit about your writing.
Well, I mean, I'm not as prolific a writer as as you make out, but I've done a few things. In regards to the book on flora and fauna, one of the I've always been interested in nature since from I was very, very young, and have had a natural affinity to it. I've noticed when I was teaching that there are some kids who are naturally attracted or tuned in to nature, and some kids who just aren't. And I seem to have been one of the ones who was, not any great accomplishment of myself. That was just the way it was. So I'd always been interested in flowers and, well, nature generally, and photography. I've always been interested in photography. And I remember when we were setting up the Meánscoil, I would be spending hours, there was no question of a 40-hour week. You were working 60, 70 hours a week to keep the thing going, because we had no funding and you had to do a million jobs. And I remember at one point saying, this is not very healthy. You really need to start doing something. You need to get out of the Cultaland, which is where the show was. So I said to myself, right, what are you interested in? Here's my doing a self-analysis, photography and nature. So I said, okay, let's go. And what I did then, anytime I was out, I would take photographs of flowers, and then I would get and get the names of them in Irish, The Irish was also an aspect of the interest. So eventually I built up a whole collection of photographs of flowers and descriptions of them in Irish. And eventually I was contacted by the producer of the book producer in Dublin, whose name I can't remember, Snoddy, and he said to me, why don't he's been wanting me to do a book on the whole civil rights period and stuff in Irish. So we then discussed this this question of the flowers, and eventually he put it together as a book. So that's how that happened. So that's where the book on flora came about. So it's a book basically of Irish flora in Irish.
Highly recommended, Fergus.
Can
I finish off? I want to give you the last 5 minutes. And we talked for over an hour, and we haven't covered in detail any of the things that I would have liked to cover. And it may be an excuse to come back and do another show. But of all the things that you've talked about, you have led from the front. You've been someone who's been a driving force in them all. Fáilte Radio, tell me how that came about.
I'm not sure I recognize your description of any, but let's go ahead. Well, as part of the whole development of the Irish language, and in the number of years, the last 20, 30, 40 years maybe, there's been a group of very dynamic Gaeilgeoirí, young people at the time in this city pushing different ideas and radical ideas forward in terms of the Irish language. And one of the principles of trying to develop any language community is, first of all, people have to acquire the language, which is where the schools come in. So the schools are the motor force. But once young people have the language, then they need to have opportunities to use it. Because if they don't use it, if the whole world is in English, then you just lapse into English and the Irish go. So you need to create other areas where the language would be used. So that's where we saw the growth of youth clubs and other activities around that. And also one of the important things in any language community is that there's a means of communication and media. And there were a small group, Gerry Fitt and Eoin O'Neill and people like that, who centred on that aspect of the language revival. And they had produced Law, the newspaper Law.
Yeah.
And they had also toyed with television at one point. But they also set up a sort of a radio station. And it was in the Cultaland for a while. It was in the Meánscoil for a while as well, and in the Cultaland. And I was involved. While my main focus at that point was still the school, one of the peripheral activities I would take part in would be producing shows and so on for the radio. And then once I left the school, and I was approached to try to develop that aspect of the revival movement. So I became involved in the Raidió Fáilte, centrally involved in that. And we were originally in the Cultaland, and the Cultaland was then refurbished in a sort of open plan type of scenario, which is not suitable for radio. Radio wants, soundproofing and things closed in rather than open. So we moved out of there to Twin Spires down the road. And from that point, it was then necessary to find a more permanent place and a more open place and a more accessible place. So we spent some years trying to find a place and to find the money. And eventually that came together with a very good team of people, Marion McAnity and Eoin O'Neill, and the committee that was helping to run the thing, Anya Garrett from the shop in the Cultaland and so on, and Gerry Fitt himself on the committee. So it was I often refer to the Raidió Fáilte team as the A team of the Gaeilgeoirí movement. Now there was another A team as well up in the Shaw's Road, and in fact there's a lot of A teams, but this was a particular A team. And so we managed to get the money together, get the site, and build the premises now at the bottom of the Falls Road. And unfortunately, it was opened not long before the COVID struck us. So there's a lot of development potential to develop that as a radio station, as a media centre, and as an Irish language centre, a beautiful little cafe and so on in there. So hopefully in the future that would be another cornerstone of the Irish language in the city.
It's the last 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes actually, but because it's you, we'll give you 5 minutes. And I've tried to list all the things that you were involved in, and I also warned the listeners of your modesty, but you know, you were central to these things. I'm not saying you were the only creator, but you certainly were a driving force in them. With the last 5 minutes, Fergus, what's the future? I know your health wasn't great last year, and looking at you now, you've greatly improved. But what's in front of you?
Well, and it's not so much as what's in front of me as what's needed. I think that's what drives me, I suppose, insofar as anything does. What needs to be done. And when I look back over the years of struggle here and what we've come through, and I sometimes see in the image where we're fighting with our nose on the ground and fighting away there and focusing on what was happening, and the level of repression that was brought upon us made that necessary, that intense focus and intense level of activity. And sometimes I feel that while we were doing that for civil rights and for democracy and for a new Ireland in whatever way you want to describe it, that way up above us there were forces that were rearranging the world, and we weren't able, not only us but all around the world, while we were focusing on what was down here, they were changing the world up there and making the world a much worse place. I grew up in the period of the mid-20th century where we benefited from the social democratic reforms that came after the First World War as a result of the fights from trade unionists and from people down through the years. And that period from maybe the 1950s to the end of the 1970s, whenever Thatcher and Reagan came in and changed the whole economic situation. And I think we're now in a situation where I have seen levels of, I never, when I was growing up, saw homeless people in Belfast. We see people lying on the streets of the city. When you go to Dublin, it's frightening, the level of poverty and homelessness and so on. I think that this society, at that level and at a world level, has changed, where the level of richness of the very rich and the poverty of the majority of people has increased to such an extent that we need to focus on how can we change that. And I think that the most important things that we need to take a grasp of is the education system and the media. I think the media, and I'm extremely critical of the major aspects of the media where they are merely mouthpieces for the status quo. And I don't think that's the role of any responsible journalist. I think it's the role of proper journalism to challenge that. And the education system, whereby young people grow up, and unless you're lucky enough to fall into some radical organisation, you don't know that Jim Larkin fought on the streets out in front of us for the right for us to join a trade union, and that people were shot dead on the Falls Road for the right to join a trade union. We're not taught that in school. We're taught about certainly, you know, the so-called great people, the kings and the queens and the leaders. We're not taught about what ordinary people did. So I think we need to change the education system, certainly history, and teach people to think critically and think for themselves. And I think the media needs to be challenged and changed. And I think that radicals and progressive people in the future need to focus a lot on those two issues. There are certainly other areas of challenge, but I think the media, the education system, because those are the things, and I said this at the very start, the most important thing, weapon, if you want to use it, in our armory is our ideas, and to give people the clarity of ideas and give people a clear view of how the world works and how the world operates. And I think that's what the challenge is in the future. And if I can add any weight to that, well, then that's what I'll be doing.
Fergus, on those very prolific words, I want to thank you for being my friend. But I want to thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you for being my guest. There's about 10 shows in your head, by the way. We cross-topped through some of it and some of the things that you've been involved in. Ever consistent, Fergus, always campaigning So Goramila Mayogat, Fergus Ó.
Very much, Joe, and thank you as well. You do a great job yourself. My hoot.
Onward.